Dear students, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to start a new module. We're going to speak about foreign policy. We're going to define the term foreign policy. We're going to outline the functions, types, and outcomes of foreign policy. We will try to determine some factors that affect foreign policy and give examples of foreign policy outcomes, and as well explain what is a comparative foreign policy. So you're not going to find one single definition of foreign policy, and therefore I've selected some definitions. So foreign policy represents the strategy governments use to guide their actions in international arena, and that would be the most simple definition. Furthermore, Modelsky defines foreign policy as a system of activities evolved by communities for changing the behavior of other states and for adjusting their own activities to the international environment. In his definition, Modelsky emphasizes on those aspects of foreign policy which aim at the change in the existing behavior of the states as primary objectives of foreign policy. Foreign policy, in fact, may include both the change in the existing behavior and continuation of the behavior at different times. So it is concerned both with the change and the status quo, and the way they face the national interest in a particular state. So what would be some functions of foreign policy? Similar to the definitions of foreign policy, you might find different characteristics in terms of functions in diverse sources. So first and foremost, foreign policy is in charge of ensuring national security, protecting national economic power and well-being, fostering development of strategy in important regions and countries, support human dignity. Foreign policy makers are also confronted in their traditional areas of operation with health-related problems and crises, the way we're facing nowadays with the COVID, for example. Frequency and intensity has increased since, I would say, of foreign policy activities has increased after the Cold War, right? And today, foreign policy focuses on tackling on international level the global public goods and the way the countries that could negotiate actually how to combine, how to comply the national interest to the issue of collective goods. Now, we might identify four main types of foreign policy. First and foremost, isolationism, when a country does not engage much in the world and keeps to oneself. For example, North Korea nowadays, previously, let's say, it was Japan up to 19th century, US in 19th century also went into isolationism, and between the First and Second World War, US also went in some few years of isolationism as well. This type of foreign policy is rare in a globalized world like the one we live today. So, because isolationism comes as an opposed strategy or of foreign policy, right, towards globalization. Another type of foreign policy is internationalism. So internationalism is opposed to isolationism, and in this case the country will prioritize global peace, security via non-military means and through multilateral organizations like the UN. There are many examples of this, like Canada, many middle-sized European nations who are highly involved in, for example, humanitarian actions, promoting peace worldwide, and so on. Another type of foreign policy is a global power or hegemonic power, or it's the policeman, right? And we have discussed the hegemony, previous hegemony in Module C. So a country like US, for example, who interferes in other countries' affairs as a way to achieve its own national security objectives could be considered a global power, and this type of would only apply to global regional superpowers. Imperialism derives from the desire to achieve a larger empire. We discussed imperialism in Module B slightly. And it is essentially an aggressive tactic whereby the country uses other countries to further its own hegemonic goals. For example, the colonial powers like UK, Netherlands, Portugal in 19th and 20th century, and almost we cannot actually consider neocolonialism and imperialism as their derivative of this. All these types of foreign policy actually might employ a combination of economic, diplomatic, political, cultural, and militaristic methods in actually following a type of foreign policy, right? So if you remember when we discussed realism, we spoke about the long-term capabilities and short-term capabilities. So this could apply actually, I would say, those involve economic, diplomatic, political, cultural means, right, or methods as long-term capabilities, and militaristic methods as short-term capabilities. Some of the expected outcomes of foreign policy, of course, foreign policy is always going to be tailored to the national interest of a particular country. So it will result from multiple forces at various levels of analysis. So foreign policy can be affected by the individual, domestic, interstate, and global actors at domestic, interstate, global, and individual level of analysis. Of course, foreign policy is going to always depend on individual decision makers, and we are going to discuss this in a separate topic. Type of the society or identity or ideology in a particular country and the government they're working with. So political systems are going to influence foreign policy as well. International and global context of their actions. So foreign policy will always be adjusted to the general context. The study of foreign policy process runs counter realism's assumption of unitary state actors, because it emphasizes on, or nowadays, it actually emphasizes on the internationalism, right? And actually, foreign policy is always going to put forward, or say the strategies used in foreign policy will always put forward the interest of the state. So foreign policy outcomes result from processes on several levels of analysis. Again, if you don't remember how levels of analysis work, you could actually return back to Module A and review them again, because it's going to be easier for you by identifying the actors of each level of analysis to actually make an overview of the foreign policy in a particular country. Now, there are particular factors that might influence foreign policy, and we're going to go through them one by one. So one of the factors that can affect foreign policy, and it's most straightforward, is the geopolitics, or let's say the geographical position of a particular country could actually affect the reactions by countries to particular events set into the motion by other countries. So every country's foreign policy is based on reacting to the world events. When the state of the world shifts, so will the state of foreign policies of individual countries. So for example, World War II, previously United States and Soviet Union were not allies. However, this global conflict put two previously hostile countries who were sharing actually different ideologies um, on the same side. The alliance itself ended up as soon as the war was over, and that caused a new shift in world geopolitical alignment. And we discussed this in Module B when we said that along with the Cold War, the world was separated into the communist bloc and capitalist bloc. Another factor which influences foreign policy is the domestic politics, and any political event at home can often reverberate abroad. And as a result, foreign policy is decided by leaders who are heavily influenced by events in the countries where they live, and this might affect directly the foreign policy. So, for instance, Trump was elected in a climate of dissatisfaction with the government of the United States. His foreign policies of May 2018 has considered essentially reversing the policies of previous administration, for example, with Iran, China, Cuba, Israel, and other countries. We have noticed that during the presidency of Trump, U.S. had heavy disagreements in terms of trade with China and in terms of other interests. Um, so the domestic politics also has a huge impact, and we will have a lot to discuss in this module about the domestic politics. Another factor which influences foreign policy, and it's one of the most important factors, is the economics. Especially in a globalized world, economics, I would say the ability to trade and the economic development of a particular state has a major role. So therefore, countries look to protect their investments and trade alliances abroad, and they will also invest in new countries and forge new trade alliances if they feel that it's a good investment. And of course, the countries are going to adjust their foreign policy according to the trade agreements they have, according to the economic interest they have. So, as an example here, we could set the dollar diplomacy. So, for example, under President Taft in the United States, the U.S. invested in Latin America and China in order to promote American foreign policy goals in these regions. This actually gave the countries the economic incentive to develop and adjust their foreign policy as being a favorable one to the United States. In long run, it actually generated authoritarian governments, especially in Latin America. It actually generated a lot of instability as part of in the long term, as part of a long-term reaction. But on the other hand, for example, for China, Chinese government actually used this advantage of investments in their own benefit and have developed the economy. Of course, we cannot speak about foreign policy without touching the topic of ideology, nationalism, and religion. So, ideals that national leaders believe in, including religious ideals, as well as nationalism, will cause countries to act in ways that would otherwise be against their national interest. So, this is because the ideologies cause leaders to see the world in a certain way, which some adepts of other ideologies would not actually agree with. So, for example, we could take Iran as an example of the 1979 revolution. So, after the revolution, the new government of Khomeini um, rejected the previous pro-American foreign policy, or I would even say pro-Western foreign policy. Despite not being in Iran's interest at that particular time, America was strong support for Iran up until that point, and Israel was a regional ally. Iran turned itself into a bastion of anti-Americanism and anti-Israel sentiment. It abandoned its allies in favor of revolutionary ideology based on some religious background, and putting it supposedly in the same side as its former rivals. Another factor that might actually influence foreign policy is history. So, historical events, as well as land claims and alliances, can affect foreign policy in present days. Countries will look back at history for justification when it comes to geopolitical actions, and actually often see their history as a guide to conducting foreign policy. For instance, China will use historical facts regarding the South China Sea as well as the disputed territory of Taiwan and the annexed Tibet to justify its claims that these areas were formerly part of bigger Chinese empire. And therefore, the Chinese diplomats will actually provide with old maps which would show that islands of South China Sea were part of Chinese imperial possessions. Furthermore, the geographical position of a particular country also plays an important role in the foreign policy. So the territory within which a country is located determines the kind of resources it needs and what kind of borders it has. This has an impact on the relations with other states. For example, Saudi Arabia, thanks to the large oil fields, Saudi Arabia made many alliances. This is because the country, which otherwise would have no interest in Saudi Arabia, look to buy Saudi oil. This also means that Saudi Arabia and other GCC states can essentially control the price of the oil, adjusting it to their geopolitical wishes. Finally, we have the media or the press, which can also influence government decision, and we're going to discuss this topic a little bit in a wider way. So media outlets promote certain viewpoints. This is often replicated by leaders in society widely. So, for example, the Vietnam War during the late 60s and 70s, media covered Vietnam War in the US because the coverage itself became increasingly negative. This is among other factors why US has withdrawn their troops in 1973 from from Vietnam and was defeated in South Vietnam later. So if you're talking about some examples of foreign policy goals, on say each country, as I mentioned, is going to follow their national interest, right? So in current era, factors are based on strength, religion, economy, per reach, geographic position. For example, the foreign policies of Arabic countries are based on religious divisions between Shia and Sunni. On the other side, many African countries made foreign policies to get maximum funds, investments from other countries, no matter if they are enemies against each other. For US to maintain balance in world politics, for Russia to regain the status of USSR in the Cold War, China to replace US and establish themselves as a superpower, European countries to save their identity on basis of language and historical values, Israel and Japan like countries to save their roots of existence in the world. For India is to get a position according to their economic, political, strategical status in the UN and other organizations. And of course, this kind of goals are can be expanded. If we're talking about the levels of analysis approach and their application to the foreign policy decision making, this tool is very useful in terms of the application to the foreign policy. So the first image, the individual level of analysis, attempts to explain war as a result of characteristics that are inherent to human nature, and is going to always be based on the individuals or personalities, leaders, some other influential actors in the world, or let's say a particular country. Furthermore, domestic level of analysis is going to focus on the characteristics of the states, their political systems, form of government, interest groups, and so on. The third image is the international system, and it incorporates all those explanations of war that lies and the characteristics of international system as well, right? And it's also going to explain the reasons why certain countries are getting well along with each other and why certain countries are ending up having a conflict. So if we apply levels of analysis approach to the 2003 US-led invasion to Iraq, we will most likely analyze the following aspects. At an individual level, we're going to look into the personalities and worldviews of key decision makers like Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld. We're going to also have a look into the regional leaders such as Saddam Hussein, for example, or other leaders in the Middle East who got involved in this particular issue. At domestic level of analysis, US as a power, Israel's lobby, American belief it needs to promote democracy, some of the multinational companies or some of the companies with the interest in terms of getting access to the resources in Iraq. At international level of analysis, we're going to have a look into the consequence of the Middle Eastern balance of power. We have also discussed the global level of analysis, and in this case, we're going to focus on the impact of United Nations and the global environment, and also the activity of the terrorist group, let's say, the rise of the activity of the terrorist groups in Iraq after the invasion occurred. The last thing we're going to discuss today is what is comparative foreign policy. So a way to analyze foreign policies and their effectiveness is to use a comparative foreign policy. So comparative foreign policy represents a field of study of foreign policy in various states in order to discover whether there are similar types of societies or governments, or they have similar interests in terms of foreign policy, or what would be the differences in the approaches to the foreign policy and the interests in particular regions, or internationally as well. Comparative foreign policy might be used to compare states at different time periods or of a single state, or it might actually select a particular time frame to analyze. The studies focus on three main variables: the size, the wealth, and extent of democratic participation of the government. There is no single rule that has been found to actually predict states' warlike tendencies, for example. And as an example here, I could say that both capitalist and communist countries prove that they can wage wars, as well as they prove that they can or want to maintain peace depending on the particular circumstances. This is it for today. This was an introduction to to the topic or to the module of foreign policy and foreign affairs, and we're going to cover the module in the next 2 weeks.